Today I'll be telling you a little bit about my research program. So, as a linguist and a PhD in psychology, my research program uses behavioral and neuroimaging techniques in concert with statistics and machine learning to explore how language, social, biological factors, especially biological sex, impact plasticity and resilience in neurological disorders such as Alzheimer's disease. So my idea today is to tell you a little bit about my story and how is it that I came to start researching risk and resilience in women. As Julia said before, I'm a linguist, but I also did a PhD in psychology, and my main interest is verbal processing and how that may be related to reserve or resilience in women. So that's what I'll be talking about today. But in order to understand that, I would like us to first reflect about the history of Alzheimer's disease, because I think that can help us understand the bigger picture, which is mainly inequalities in women's health. Then I'll be talking about resilience, because I believe that studying resilience in women is one way of addressing some of these inequalities. And finally, I will focus on two specific forms of resilience that are brain reserve and cognitive reserve. And as I said before, I'm gonna make emphasis on verbal memory as a form of cognitive reserve in women, because, well, that's my main area of research. Okay, so let's analyze some current statistics. We know now that today over 46 million people are living with dementia around the world. And by 2050, this number is expected to increase to around 130 million. We also know now that women are more affected by Alzheimer's disease than men. For instance, in Canada, approximately 600,000 individuals are living with dementia, and around 72% of those diagnosed with dementia are women. Now, the sources of these sex differences in diagnosis are still unknown. So, in order to try to understand and for us to reflect later, why is it that we still do not know which are the sources of these sex disparities in diagnosis? I would like us to consider, to go back to history and consider the first case of Alzheimer's disease, which is that of a 51-year-old woman named Auguste Deter. In 1906, Dr. Alzheimer noticed that Auguste had abnormal behavior such as short-term memory problems, short-term amnestic problems, disorientation, among other symptoms. He diagnosed the case as dementia, and later brain biopsy confirmed what we now know as Alzheimer's disease pathology. Now, this was the first case of Alzheimer's disease, and as I said before, this occurred in 1906. Today, 1 century later, we are facing this problem of women being more affected by Alzheimer's disease than men. So, if the first case of AD was that of a woman, why, I think it is fair that we ask today, why is it that we still don't know how women's biology is related to AD pathology? So in order to answer some of these questions, again, I think it is important to understand the historical reasons. Historically, women have been excluded from clinical research because their biology was considered more complicated than that of men. And this applied to both human and the non-human animal research. So in animal models, for instance, female rats would typically be removed from experimentation because they were considered to be more variable than males, since they had to be tested at each stage of their menstrual cycle. Now, in humans, not just biology, that is to say, it's not just that the biology of women was considered to be much more complicated than that of men, but also some other social factors need to be considered. So, as for instance, as primary caregivers of young children, women maybe didn't have much time to participate in research studies. Now, currently, there are policies to ensure that women are included in clinical research, and we see that today, more women are now enrolled in the randomized clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease than males. And this, one would think that this makes the analysis of sex differences in Alzheimer's disease more feasible. But only 12% up to date, only 12% of the published articles have reported sex-stratified results. So the role of women's biology in Alzheimer's disease and the question that we're trying to answer today, or the question that we're considering today, as regards the role of women's biology in AD and this question of sex differences in the diagnosis of dementia remains unknown. Now, this is important because understanding women's biology is crucial. I think it might be the key to understand the mechanisms behind their resilience against AD. The concept of resilience is in general used to refer to the ability of the brain to maintain cognition and function against normal or pathological aging. Now, this term, resilience, represents multiple concepts in the literature, and the researchers have posed different definitions for each of these concepts. So in order to make things clearer today, I will follow the current consensus framework, and I am going to refer to resilience as a general term that includes both cognitive and brain reserve. Cognitive reserve can be understood as the flexibility of cognitive processes in the face of normal aging or disease, like, for example, neurodegeneration. And brain reserve can be understood as the neurobiological state of the brain at any point in time. For instance, the number of neurons, synapses, or white matter integrity. Now, both cognitive and brain reserve protect against Alzheimer's disease. The idea here is that patients who have greater resilience or greater reserve in general typically show normal or even better than expected outcomes despite the exposure to healthy aging or neurodegeneration. Okay, so which are the mechanisms related to cognitive and brain reserve in women? In order to answer this question, I conducted a review of the literature. This is my first work with Dr. Einstein, and well, hopefully will be published soon. Here we included empirical studies with human and animal models, literature reviews, as well as meta-analyses. in order to enhance our knowledge of the literature and be able to identify new emerging perspectives. So the inclusion criteria here were articles that were published starting 1990 and later. And well, we also included articles that were in English. So the exclusion criteria were articles that were not written in English, that focused on neurodegenerative diseases other than Alzheimer's disease, like, for example, Huntington disease or frontotemporal dementia. And we also excluded articles that discuss neuronal or non-neuronal associations with dementias other than Alzheimer's disease. And finally, we also excluded studies focusing on gender instead of biological sex. And well, of course, we also excluded gray literature such as theses or conference procedures. Now, initially, a total of 4,808 articles were identified as potentially relevant, but after screening, only 158 full articles were selected for analysis. We then organized the articles into themes and sub-themes to make results clearer. So, as regards resilience in women, we identified three main themes. The first is related to neuroplasticity or brain plasticity and how sex hormones might affect brain reserve. For instance, we identified that an important sub-theme here is the role of estrogens in women, especially estradiol and neuroplasticity. Now, these changes in the brain may lead to changes at the cognitive level. So we also identified as a main theme cognitive reserve, but specifically verbal memory related to cognitive reserve. This is an important theme because abundant research, we saw when we were doing the literature review, that abundant research has shown that women have a verbal advantage. And this is like a consistent finding in the literature. A verbal advantage for women. And this verbal advantage for women would last even in the first stages of neurodegeneration, like, for example, mild cognitive impairment or MCI. And finally, we also identified as an emergent theme the importance of linguistic experiences in general and how the relationship between sex hormones, like, for example, estradiol and linguistic experiences is important in the analysis of women's resilience. Now, let's see some examples of the articles that were reviewed. And again, I always like to start with the first studies. In this case, the first report of resilience was shown in 1988. It did not analyze data by sex, but the cohort included 137 older adults, and 81% in this case were women. The authors examined post-mortem brains of these older adults and found extensive AD pathology in some of these patients, but also greater number of neurons and greater brain weight when compared to age-matched control. So we can consider this study from the perspective of brain reserve, and we can imagine that there might be some mechanism that help these patients, which again were mostly women, avoid neuron loss. Now, the authors here did not study how is it that these women may have been protected from neuron loss. But nowadays, there is evidence indicated that this issue might be related to sex hormones. So just a very brief review on sex hormones now. We know that the adult brain contains 100 billion cells, including both neurons and glia cells. And both neuron and glia cells or non-neural cells are influenced by sex hormones. The sex hormones such as estrogens, progesterone, and androgens in general are produced by the gonads and other tissues like, for example, the brain. So it makes sense that sex hormones are important for brain function. Now, there are multiple receptors for estrogens. There are different receptors for estrogens, progesterone, and androgens. And these receptors interact with sex hormones, and they affect nervous system either directly or indirectly. Indeed, sex hormones modulate neural activity, synaptic plasticity, neuronal survival, and cognition. Recent evidence also indicates that steroids hormones or sex hormones may even protect the brain against Alzheimer's disease pathology, and thus they may be key in understanding or explaining these sex differences in Alzheimer's disease. And this analyzing sex hormones may actually be the key to understand why is it that women are more affected by Alzheimer's disease than men. Now, there is evidence showing that different aspects in women's biology allow them to rewire their brains and thus adapt to change and maybe be able to face pathology. The role of sex hormones here is crucial because sex hormones evoke changes at the neuronal level. And this happens throughout the whole lifespan of a woman. So, for example, we have different major hormonal shifts throughout the lifespan, such as puberty, pregnancy, and menopause. And they all trigger neuroplastic processes, meaning they all lead to a reconfiguration of the brain or a rewiring of the brain. Let's consider aging. Aging is also another major or involves major hormonal shifts, in the sense that aging is characterized by gonadal functional loss, and it's usually accompanied by subtle cognitive decline and frailty. Now, there are fluctuations of sex hormones due to aging in both men and women. But the fluctuations in men are a gradual process and they occur slowly with advancing age. In women, on the other hand, the changes are more sudden, profound, drastic, and variable. But despite this variability, plasticity or neuroplasticity seems to be a constant in the lifespan of women. So in this sense, different studies have shown that estrogens modulate hippocampal plasticity in women. More specifically, estradiol modulates neurogenesis, and it is related to increased cell proliferation and decreased cell death in areas that are mainly affected by Alzheimer's disease, such as the dentate gyrus. Now, this is important because the previous evidence have shown that the dentate gyrus withstands the formation of plaques, tangles, and neuronal death until late stages of Alzheimer's disease. So the idea here is that estradiol may modulate neurogenesis or plasticity and avoid neuron loss. Okay, let's analyze now examples of cognitive reserve. as I said before, I mean, everything that I have said so far refers to brain reserve, or these changes in the brain. Now, these changes in the brain may lead to changes at the cognitive level. So let's analyze examples of cognitive reserve in women. An example of cognitive reserve comes from one of the most famous longitudinal studies of aging. In this case, a cohort of all women. The authors here analyzed or studied the written autobiographies of around 700 nuns from the Notre Dame congregation, and they used linguistic density to predict resilience. Now, linguistic density can be understood as the ability to produce complex human communication in a language. Now, the results showed that an essay's lack of linguistic density functioned as a significant risk predictor of its author risk for developing AD in old age. Now, roughly 80% of the nuns whose writing was measured as having low linguistic density went on to develop Alzheimer's disease in old age. But interestingly, many of these nuns who did not develop AD still did show Alzheimer's brain pathology upon autopsy. That is to say, they had a form of reserve in the brain that helped them withstand the effects of pathology. And again, a very important measure of reserve here was the ability to produce complex human communication in a language. Now, to my knowledge, this is also one of the first reports of verbal processing as a form of reserve. Now, several studies have shown that this verbal advantage in women may be a form of cognitive reserve. In general, women have shown higher verbal cognitive reserve than men in normal aging, and this would last even into the pre-Alzheimer's disease stage, which is mild cognitive impairment, but also in the face of beta-amyloid burden and greater tau pathology. Now, I believe that understanding the role of verbal memory as a reserve factor in women is crucial, because not just because we can, by analyzing verbal cognitive reserve in women, we can understand some of the resilience mechanisms against Alzheimer's disease, but also because most of the neuropsychological tests that are used to diagnose Alzheimer's disease involve verbal processing. So if verbal memory is indeed a cognitive reserve factor in women, and women have reserved verbal function compared to men, women may be underdiagnosed for AD. That is, we might need more sensitive tools to diagnose AD in women, especially in women that have different linguistic experiences. Let's consider, for example, the case of multilingualism, or the case of those women who speak or have knowledge of more than one language. So the idea here is, like, given that there might be a women's verbal cognitive reserve linked to estradiol, I believe that it is essential to analyze different linguistic experiences and how they might provide resilience to cognitive aging. Now, multilingualism is very interested in this case in AD research, because multilingualism has also been suggested as a form of cognitive reserve. This is actually what I focused on my previous postdoctoral position at York University. In general, I studied how the knowledge of two different languages or multilingualism may lead to cognitive reserve. So I'm now going to explain very briefly this idea of multilingualism, or why multilingualism may lead to resilience or reserve in the brain. And in order to explain this, I have to answer this question: how does multilingualism modify cognition? So the idea here is that in a bilingual person, or in a multilingual person, that is to say a person who has knowledge and frequent use of two languages or more than two languages, in the brain of those individuals, all languages are constantly activated at the same time. So the bilingual person has a conflict, in the sense that all languages are constantly activated, and the bilingual has different representations of those linguistic systems. Now, there is a conflict in, let's say, in rough terms, in the brain of these bilinguals, and bilinguals have to solve this conflict. How is it that they do it? We don't know exactly which is the mechanism, but in general, we believe it is related to executive functioning. That is to say, memory, attention, or inhibitory control, functions that are here in the prefrontal cortex. And this exercise in executive functioning would lead to reserve. For instance, bilingualism may contribute to cognitive reserve in that it is associated with better cognitive outcomes after stroke than monolinguals. In order to show an example of how bilingualism may be related to cognitive reserve, today I'm just going to show you a lesion study. This is work from my PhD in Argentina, and this is a paper that we published in 2019. So I'm just going to describe now very briefly this lesion study. This is a case of CG. CG at the age of 43. She suffered from sudden severe headache and loss of consciousness. During hospitalization, the radiological findings revealed a saracnoid hemorrhage due to a ruptured 5 mm fusiform aneurysm while at the right medial cerebral artery, and this later complicated with severe vasospasm. Now, this first injury led to extensive damage of the right hemisphere, and also including frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital regions in the left hemisphere. Also, bilateral portions of the insula and the amygdala were affected. Now, the patient spent 41 days in intensive care, and she was then discharged with just a moderate left paresis. Now, 1 year later, she started having seizures, and so she underwent a craniotomy with removal of the right frontal, parietal, and temporal bones, and implantation of her prosthesis and a titanium plaque. Now, around 2 months later, she suffered a second stroke. In this case, the neurologists believed that this second stroke might have been produced by a sudden reswallowing that might have been related to the previous surgery. Now, this resulted in damage to the left anterior insular cortex and its underlying white matter, the putamen, and the dorsolateral amygdala. Now, after clinical stabilization, the patient presented neither additional neurological deficits nor cognitive, emotional, or behavioral impairments. Now, the only immediate changes that she reported were loss of sensitivity on the right hand and the transitory form of personality color synesthesia. She was soon discharged to her home under the supervision of a caregiver and with just, pharmacological treatment. The patient then agreed to undergo an extensive assessment, including formal neuropsychological evaluations. And well, these formal neuropsychological evaluations after discharge revealed a high preservation of executive functions in general. That is to say, for instance, the patient scored 2530 on the INECO frontal screening battery, which is an executive screening test that was developed by the neuropsychologists at the INECO clinic in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Now, her overall cognitive status was also preserved with a score of 96 out of 100 on the Argentine adaptation of the Addenbrooke's cognitive examination revised. As we can see here in this table, comparison of these outcomes with social demographically matched controls showed no significant differences. So the idea here is that this might be a case of plasticity in a bilingual woman and who suffer from two different strokes, one in the left hemisphere and then another one in the right hemisphere. And she presents no cognitive impairment. So the idea here is that this might be a case of plasticity and there might be some compensatory brain changes that allow the patient to function properly despite the extensive lesion. Now, there are a lot of papers about and abundant literature about multilingualism as a form of resilience or as a form of reserve. And there is actually a current debate in the field about whether bilingualism actually leads to reserve or not. I am not going to get into the details today, but I can tell you in general, very briefly, what is the state of the art. So this is a figure from one of my papers that has recently been accepted. Let me first explain the color scheme. So here I used blue to indicate the studies that have shown the studies that have shown or that have included samples of participants that spoke two languages, that is to say, just bilinguals. And I used purple to indicate the studies that have included samples of patients that spoke more than two languages, that is to say, multilinguals. Now, the little green stars here indicate those studies that have found positive effects, that is to say, those studies that have found that bilingualism is actually, bilingualism or multilingualism is actually a form of reserve. And then these orange red crosses here indicate those studies that have found null results, or those studies that have found that bilingualism is not a form of cognitive reserve, or is not a reserve process. Now, the first evidence comes from retrospective approaches in which they found, these papers found that bilinguals show the first symptoms of dementia 4 years later than monolinguals. This pattern was first published and reported here in Canada, but then it was replicated in Belgium, India, China, and elsewhere. But these are all retrospective analysis of clinical records. More recently, several studies have included brain measures. And in this case, all the studies that analyze brain structure agree that bilingualism enhances reserve. Now, the general pattern here is that bilinguals can withstand more brain atrophy than monolinguals for similar clinical dementia levels. Now, however, as we can see here, all the studies concerning the progression of the disease in bilingual, as reflected in these longitudinal studies, or yes, longitudinal approaches, have reported null results. That is to say, they have not found bilingualism to be a proxy of cognitive reserve. Now, the studies that have included multilingual samples have reported a positive effect even in longitudinal samples. So I think that it is crucial to continue investigating and analyze why is it that we generally find positive effects in retrospective studies. We also find positive effects in all the studies that have included neuroimaging, but we don't usually find effects in longitudinal studies. Now, as I said before, I'm not going to get into the details of that. For today's purpose, I would like just to highlight that only one study has looked at sex differences in old bilingual adults. And well, I believe that the first author of this study is one of the organizers of the event. So I'm not going to get into the details of the study. We can maybe ask her later. But in general, the authors here found that women had more cognitive decline than men, but their performance improved with bilingualism. Now, the problem here, as I said before, only one study has looked at sex differences. So the problem here is that if bilingualism is a form of reserve, we do not know how reserve actually acts in multilingual women. And well, this is one of the main ideas that I'm trying to incorporate into my research program with Dr. Einstein. I believe that verbal memory and multilingualism may have an additive effect on cognitive reserve for women. But I think that in order to assess cognitive reserve in multilingual women, it is crucial to measure sex hormones. Because as I have said before, or as I have shown before, sex hormones modulate neuroplasticity or may modulate neuroplasticity in women. That is to say, they may rewire or lead to a reconfiguration of women's brain. And that, of course, also would lead to cognitive reserve. And of course, that would affect the levels of cognitive reserve. Now, most importantly, analyzing the interaction of different reserve proxies may also help understand why only some women get AD. I mean, all women age and some experience severe drops in sex hormones, especially estradiol, but only some of them get Alzheimer's disease. Why is that? The reasons for this are still unknown. It might be that Alzheimer's pathology is affected by different levels of reserve or by different forms of resilience. For instance, it might be that multilingual women may in fact be diagnosed so long into the disease that neural degeneration has progressed long past rescue. So again, it is very important, I think, here to highlight that if verbal memory is a form of reserve in women, then in the case of bilingual women, we might need more sensitive measures in order to diagnose dementia. Now, to sum up, the first person diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease was a woman, and also some of the most significant reports of resilience were done in cohorts that included mostly women. However, this higher risk of Alzheimer's disease in women has only gradually come to recognition. And well, now that women are more affected by Alzheimer's, now that we know, or that now that the statistics show that women may be more affected by Alzheimer's disease than men, I think it is crucial to understand the cognitive and brain reserve mechanisms or the resilience mechanisms in general that are associated to their biology. In brief, estradiol may prevent neuronal death, shape hippocampal plasticity, and modulate neurogenesis. So understanding how estradiol is related to different forms of reserve might be crucial to advance in health equity. And that is all. Thank you so much. Now I'll open the room to questions.